Welcome to Bible Study 24H. Here, we don't just tell history, we reveal the soul behind it. Today, we bring you an extraordinary story about Pope Francis, not just the facts of his papacy, but the human heart behind the white robe, the sacrifices, the love, the legacy that goes far beyond titles. If you believe stories like this matter, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs inspiration, and subscribe to Bible Study 24H for more deep, powerful journeys into faith history and the truths that shape our world. Let's dive in. Before the world knew him as Pope Francis, before the crowds chanted his name from St. Peter's Square, there was simply Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a boy from a humble neighborhood in Buenos Aires, Argentina, born on December 17, 1936. Jorge was the eldest of 5 children in a family of Italian immigrants who had fled Mussolini's fascist regime in search of safety and opportunity. His father, Mario José Bergoglio, worked as an accountant for the railways. His mother, Regina Maria Sivori, was a homemaker deeply religious and the heart of the family. They lived in the Flora district, a neighborhood that knew both hard work and hard times. Jorge grew up surrounded by simplicity. There were no golden opportunities, no family fortunes, just the steady rhythm of ordinary life, school, church chores, and the laughter and quarrels of siblings. His parents taught him the values of humility, compassion, and resilience, often by quiet example rather than words. As a young boy, Jorge was bright, observant, and deeply curious. He had a love for science and chose to study chemistry in high school. While his classmates dreamed of wealth or adventure, Jorge quietly took on odd jobs, working as a janitor, a bouncer, and even in a lab, not out of ambition, but simply to help the family make ends meet. He was the kind of young man who noticed when others were struggling and lent a hand without needing recognition. Yet despite his growing knowledge and practical skills, Jorge felt a quiet restlessness inside. His parents encouraged him to continue his scientific path, to pursue medicine or research, but something in his heart held back. That something stirred more deeply one spring day when, at age 19, Jorge passed by a church and almost on impulse stepped inside to go to confession. He later described this moment as life-changing. The priest he spoke to that day, a man of gentle presence and profound wisdom, stirred something dormant in him. For the first time, Jorge felt the call of something greater than career or family expectations, but discernment was not a straight path. In his early 20s, Jorge experienced doubt. He developed feelings for a girl, a moment of tender human love that caused him to wonder, was he truly called to religious life? Was he ready to give up the possibility of marriage, of a family of his own? As he wrestled with these questions, life intervened in a dramatic and painful way. At age 21, Jorge fell gravely ill with pneumonia. His condition worsened rapidly, and he nearly died. In a desperate attempt to save his life, doctors removed part of his right lung. The road to recovery was long and difficult, but this brush with death left an indelible mark on his soul. Jorge emerged from his illness changed not just physically but spiritually. He realized in a way that only those who have faced death can, that life was fragile and finite, and that he wanted to dedicate his remaining days to something meaningful, something eternal. In 1960, at the age of 24, Jorge joined the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, a decision that would shape the entire trajectory of his life. The Jesuits were known for their rigorous intellectual training, their deep commitment to poverty and service, and their readiness to go anywhere in the world for the church, no matter how difficult the conditions. For Jorge, these values resonated powerfully. The Jesuit motto, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God, became his personal compass. He took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, promising to live simply, to serve selflessly, and to follow God's call wherever it led. During his years of Jesuit formation, Jorge earned a master's degree in philosophy and began teaching literature and psychology at several high schools. His students later remembered him as both firm and compassionate, a man who challenged them to think deeply, but who also cared deeply about their struggles. In 1969, at the age of 33, Jorge was ordained as a priest. He continued to pursue theological studies and even spent time abroad, making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and learning English in Ireland, but his heart always belonged to the people of Argentina, especially the poor and forgotten. It was during this time that Jorge's sense of mission crystallized. He saw his priesthood not as a path to power or prestige, but as a life of service. He rode public buses, walked through shanty towns, visited hospitals and prisons, and developed a reputation as a priest of the people. Even as he rose through the ranks of the church, becoming a provincial leader. And eventually, Archbishop Jorge remained deeply grounded in the struggles of ordinary people. What made his calling so powerful was not just his formal role, but his quiet authenticity. Jorge wasn't interested in building a name for himself. He was interested in meeting people where they were lifting burdens and pointing them toward hope. His path to religious life had been shaped by hardship, doubt, illness, and sacrifice. But through it all, Jorge Mario Bergoglio discovered the profound truth that our lives are not ultimately defined by what we achieve, but by whom we serve. And this was only the beginning of his journey. By the late 1990s, Jorge Mario Bergoglio had already made a name for himself, but not in the way many imagine. He wasn't a flashy figure. He didn't command attention with grandeur or wealth. Instead, people noticed him because of his humility, his tireless work in the poorest neighborhoods, and his sharp, courageous voice speaking out against injustice. In 1997, he was appointed Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and 4 years later, in 2001, Pope John Paul II elevated him to cardinal. At this stage, many within the church and beyond began to take note. Cardinal Bergoglio was known as the slum bishop, a man who deliberately avoided the luxurious trappings of office. He lived in a modest apartment instead of the archbishop's palace, cooked his own meals, and rode public transportation to meet his parishioners. But beyond these humble gestures, Bergoglio was also a fierce reformer. He criticized priests who lived extravagantly and redirected church resources toward the poor. He expanded the number of priests working in the shanty towns, doubled down on social justice efforts, and spoke boldly against the corruption he saw both inside and outside the church. Yet when the papal seat became vacant in 2005, after the death of Pope John Paul II, few thought Bergoglio would be chosen. During the secret conclave of cardinals, it said that Bergoglio was one of the leading contenders. But in a moment of characteristic humility, he reportedly made an emotional plea to his fellow cardinals to vote for Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, urging a quick resolution rather than further political maneuvering. Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI, and Bergoglio quietly returned to his pastoral work in Argentina. But history wasn't done with him yet. In 2013, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in nearly 600 years, a reigning Pope, Benedict XVI, resigned, citing his declining health and advanced age. This decision shocked the Catholic world, as popes had traditionally remained in office until death. The papal throne was once again vacant, and the world watched with bated breath as the cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel for the conclave. This time, the tide turned. On March 13, 2013, after 2 days and 5 ballots, white smoke rose above the Vatican. The crowd erupted in cheers as it was announced that 76-year-old Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio had been elected as the 266th Pope. But it wasn't just his election that made history. It was everything that came next. Bergoglio was the first Jesuit ever elected to the papacy. He was the first pope from the Americas. He was the first non-European pope since Gregory III of Syria, nearly 1300 years earlier. And perhaps, most tellingly, he chose a name no pope had ever taken before Francis, in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, the 13th century friar, who renounced wealth, embraced poverty, and became a symbol of simplicity and peace. The world took notice immediately. As the newly elected Pope Francis stepped onto the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square, the symbolism was unmistakable. Unlike his predecessors, who had donned lavish red robes and golden crosses, Francis appeared in simple white, wearing the same iron cross he had worn as Archbishop. He asked the crowd not to cheer, but to pray for him. It was a small but powerful gesture that set the tone for his papacy. From the very beginning, Francis made clear that his reign would be marked by humility, reform, and a return to the core values of the gospel. He refused to live in the luxurious papal apartments, choosing instead a modest room in the Vatican guest house. He canceled the multi-million-euro bonuses that were typically given to Vatican officials after a papal election and redirected the money to charity. On his first Holy Thursday, instead of holding a grand ceremony in a basilica, Francis went to a juvenile detention center where he washed and kissed the feet of 12 young inmates, including 2 women and 2 Muslims. His Easter homily was a plea for world peace, and in the years that followed, Francis became known as a global moral voice, advocating for action on climate change, defending the rights of refugees, and calling for a more compassionate, inclusive church. But Francis was not without controversy. His progressive stances on issues like divorce, LGBTQ outreach, and the role of women in the church angered many conservatives. At the same time, he faced intense criticism for the church's past failures to address sexual abuse by clergy. Though initially slow to act, Francis eventually took decisive measures, removing bishops and launching investigations and publicly apologizing to victims. For Francis, being pope was never about power, it was about service. He saw the papacy not as a throne, but as a mission. His work, his gestures, his words, they were all directed at reminding the world of what truly matters: love, mercy, justice, humility. Even as his health declined and he began using a wheelchair, Francis remained committed to his mission. He called together global synods to discuss the future of the church, including, for the first time in history, allowing women to vote in these deliberations. He continued to speak out against war, poverty, and environmental destruction, and he never stopped advocating for those on the margins. When Pope Francis passed away in April 2025, the world mourned not just a leader but a shepherd. He left behind a church that was more open, more humble, and more committed to the teachings of Christ than it had been in decades. When historians look back on Pope Francis' time as leader of the Catholic Church, they will not just remember a list of policies or a string of official acts. They will remember a spirit, a profound shift in how the Church saw itself and its mission. From the very beginning, Francis made it clear that his papacy would not be about pomp and ceremony, but about service, mercy, and justice. His famous words, "I see the church as a field hospital after battle," captured his vision perfectly. The church to him was not a fortress of rules or a place for the perfect. It was a home for the wounded, the broken, the searching. One of the most striking parts of Francis' legacy was his personal lifestyle. He chose to live, simply rejecting the lavish papal apartments for a modest guest house room. He traveled in small cars, carried his own briefcase, and often reached out personally to those in need. These choices were not for show. They were a deliberate message. Francis wanted the world to understand that the heart of the gospel is humility, not power. Beyond personal example, Francis spearheaded major reforms within the Vatican itself. He tackled corruption in the Vatican Bank, cutting off shady financial flows and demanding transparency. He streamlined church bureaucracy, emphasizing pastoral care over institutional prestige. He repeatedly urged bishops and cardinals to focus less on careerism and more on shepherding their people with love. Francis was also a pope of the global peripheries. He consistently raised his voice for refugees, migrants, and the displaced, calling on wealthier nations to open their doors. He championed the cause of the poor, reminding the world that poverty is not just an economic issue, but a moral one. His groundbreaking encyclica Laudato Si addressed climate change not only as an environmental crisis, but as a deep injustice against the poor, who are the first and most devastatingly affected. But perhaps one of his most enduring legacies was his attempt to open the Church's heart to those it had traditionally excluded. On issues like divorce remarriage and LGBTQ outreach, Francis took a noticeably pastoral approach. He did not rewrite core doctrines, but he emphasized the need for compassion, accompaniment, and dialogue. His famous response to a question about gay Catholics, "Who am I to judge?" echoed around the world and signaled a new tone of welcome. Francis also expanded the role of women in church leadership. For the first time, women were given voting rights in synods, historic gatherings where bishops and lay people come together to discuss the future of the church. Though he maintained that women could not be ordained as priests, Francis consistently called for deeper inclusion of women's voices in church decision-making. He was not without criticism. Some saw his reforms as too slow, others as too radical. Conservative factions within the church accused him of diluting doctrine, while progressive voices pushed him to go even further. But through it all, Francis maintained his balance, trying to lead a church that was both faithful to its roots and responsive to the signs of the times. One of the most painful parts of his papacy was the sexual abuse crisis. At first, Francis appeared hesitant to take strong action, even defending some bishops accused of covering up abuse. But after meeting directly with victims, particularly during a visit to Chile, Francis underwent what many described as a public conversion. He issued a sweeping apology, fired bishops who had been complicit, and launched investigations that exposed abuse and cover-ups across the globe. For Francis, reform was never just about fixing systems. It was about healing people. He believed deeply that the church must be a living sign of God's mercy in the world. That meant listening, changing, apologizing when needed, and always returning to the heart of the gospel. Even as his health declined in his final years, Francis remained engaged. He used a wheelchair after knee surgery, battled respiratory illness, and faced calls to resign. But he kept going, determined to see through the final stages of his work. Perhaps the most symbolic culmination of his efforts was the Synod on Synodality, a global gathering where bishops, priests, religious, and lay people, including women, came together to discuss the church's future. For Francis, this wasn't just another meeting. It was the embodiment of his lifelong belief that the church must be a listening church, a church on a journey where everyone has a voice. When Francis passed away in April 2025, tributes poured in from around the world. People remembered not just a pope, but a man who lived his faith with radical authenticity. They remembered the pope who bent down to kiss the feet of prisoners, who ate meals with the homeless, who spoke uncomfortable truths to the powerful. His critics remembered him too, but even many of them admitted that Francis had reshaped the conversation around what it means to lead, to serve, and to love in the modern age. Most of all, Pope Francis left behind a church that was more awake, more humble, and more committed to walking alongside a broken world. His legacy was not perfect, and the church still faces many challenges. But Francis gave the world a reminder that leadership in the image of Christ is not about domination or control. It is about washing feet, lifting burdens, and opening doors of mercy. When historians reflect on the papacy of Pope Francis, they will not merely recount the timeline of events or the policies he enacted. They will speak of a deep, transformative spirit, a shift in tone, vision, and heart that changed how the Catholic Church saw itself and how it reached out to the world. From the very beginning, Pope Francis signaled that his leadership would break from tradition, not by rejecting the Church's core teachings, but by radically recentering them on mercy, humility, and service. He famously declared, "I see the Church as a field hospital after battle." In this image, the Church is not a citadel for the perfect, nor a courtroom for the guilty, but a place of healing for the wounded. One of the most striking aspects of Francis's papacy was his personal lifestyle. He rejected the grand papal apartments, choosing instead to live in a modest guest house within the Vatican. He rode in small cars, carried his own briefcase, and sometimes even slipped out at night to visit the poor in Rome. These choices were not mere publicity stunts. They were powerful signals to the faithful, a reminder that at its heart, the Church is called to simplicity and closeness to the people. But beyond symbolic gestures, Francis pursued real institutional reforms. One of his most determined efforts was to clean up the Vatican's troubled finances. For decades, the Vatican Bank had been plagued by scandals, corruption, and mismanagement. Francis established commissions, demanded audits, and pushed through transparency measures that reduced shady financial dealings and redirected money toward charitable works. Inside the church hierarchy, he championed a pastoral, rather than bureaucratic model of leadership. He warned bishops and cardinals against careerism, reminding them that their primary duty was not to wield influence or climb ranks, but to serve as humble shepherds to their flocks. He often spoke of the danger of a self-referential church, a church more concerned with its own preservation and power than with reaching out to the margins of society. Francis's concern for the margins was especially visible in his global advocacy. He spoke forcefully on behalf of refugees and migrants, urging wealthier nations to welcome those fleeing war and poverty. He emphasized that climate change was not just an environmental issue, but a profound injustice against the poor who are disproportionately harmed by ecological degradation. His landmark encyclical Laudato Si became one of the most widely discussed papal documents in decades, inspiring faith-based climate action across the world. At the same time, Francis sought to soften the Church's approach to people who had long felt excluded. On issues like divorce, remarriage, and LGBTQ outreach, he struck a pastoral tone urging compassion and accompaniment rather than condemnation. While he did not change core doctrines, he emphasized that every person, regardless of their situation, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. His now famous remark, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about gay Catholics, echoed globally and became a symbol of a more open, welcoming church. Francis also made historic moves toward including women's voices in church decision-making. For centuries, key synods gatherings where the future of church policy is debated were reserved for male clergy. Under Francis, for the first time, women were given the right to vote in these synods, marking a significant, if still incomplete, step toward greater inclusion. He called repeatedly for more opportunities for women in leadership roles, though he maintained the Church's teaching on male-only priesthood, a stance that disappointed many Reform advocates. One of the most painful and controversial chapters of his papacy was the handling of clerical sexual abuse. At first, Francis appeared slow to grasp the depth of the crisis, even defending certain bishops who had been accused of covering up abuse. But after confronting victims face to face, particularly during a pivotal visit to Chile, Francis underwent what many described as a public reckoning. He apologized not only for the crimes committed, but also for the failures of church leadership. He removed bishops, launched international investigations, and established stronger procedures to hold perpetrators accountable. Throughout his reign, Francis balanced progressive ideals with an understanding of the need for unity within the global church. His papacy was marked by tension between conservative factions who viewed his changes as too radical and progressive voices who wanted him to go further. Despite this, Francis remained steady, emphasizing dialogue, discernment, and the search for common ground. Even as he aged and faced health challenges, Francis stayed deeply engaged in his mission. After knee surgery, he began using a wheelchair, but continued to appear regularly at public events, issue major statements, and convene global gatherings. Perhaps the most symbolic culmination of his efforts was the Synod on Synodality, a historic assembly where for the first time laypeople, women, and clergy from around the world came together to discuss the Church's path forward. For Francis, this synod embodied the essence of his vision, a church that listens, learns, and walks together, guided by the Holy Spirit. By the time of his passing in April 2025, Pope Francis had left an undeniable imprint on the Catholic Church and on the world. Tributes came not just from within Catholic circles, but from global leaders, activists, and ordinary people who had been touched by his message of mercy, justice, and love. They remembered a pope who washed the feet of prisoners, who embraced the outcast, who spoke uncomfortable truths to the powerful. They remembered a leader who understood that the heart of faith is not rules or status, but a living relationship with God and with others. Pope Francis's legacy will continue to shape the Church for generations. His papacy reminded the world that, at its best, the Church is a beacon of hope, a servant of the poor, and a living sign of God's boundless mercy. Though his time as Pope has ended, the seeds he planted of reform, of humility, of compassion will continue to grow. By early 2025, Pope Francis was in his late 80s, a man who had lived a long, extraordinary life. His health, which had been fragile for years, began to decline further. After decades of tireless service to the poor, to the Church, to the world, his body was simply wearing out. He had been using a wheelchair since a knee operation in 2022, but he remained active and engaged. Even after a bout of bronchitis and pneumonia in February 2025, Francis amazed many by appearing at his window in the Vatican to bless the Easter crowds on April 20th, just the day before he passed away. On the morning of April 21, 2025, at 7:35 a.m., Pope Francis died peacefully at his residence, Domus Sanctae Marthae, in the Vatican. He was 88 years old. News of his passing swept across the world. Crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square to mourn, to pray, and to remember a man who had touched lives far beyond the boundaries of Catholicism. But even as the world grieved, the ancient machinery of the Church began to move. When a pope dies, centuries-old protocols are triggered. First, the death is officially confirmed by a doctor and a ceremonial Vatican official, who traditionally calls the pope's baptismal name 3 times, waiting each time for a response. When none comes, the official solemnly declares the pontiff dead and the papal office vacant. Francis's papal ring, the gold fisherman's ring that symbolizes his authority, was ceremonially destroyed, and his private papal apartment was sealed. Vatican officials informed the press, and 9 days of mourning officially began. Unlike his predecessors, Pope Francis had requested a simpler funeral, consistent with his lifelong emphasis on humility. Rather than being laid on a grand elevated catafalque surrounded by layers of pageantry, his body was displayed in an open wooden coffin accessible to the faithful who came to pay their last respects. He became the first pope in over a century not to be interred in the Vatican, instead choosing the quieter Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica in Rome, where 7 other popes are buried, the most recent being Clement IX in the 1600s. With the papal throne vacant, the focus turned to the process of choosing a new pope, a ritual as mysterious as it is ancient. 15 to 20 days after the pope's death, the College of Cardinals, the body of senior church leaders, gathered in Rome for what is called the conclave. This word, derived from the Latin cum clave, meaning with a key, refers to the strict secrecy under which the cardinals meet. Only cardinals under the age of 80 are eligible to vote. At the time, there were 137 such cardinals. Technically, they could elect any baptized Catholic male in the world, but in practice they nearly always choose one of their own. The cardinals entered the Sistine Chapel, where they were locked away from all outside communication. No phones, no internet, no news. Their task was not simply political, it was spiritual. They were called to seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit in selecting a leader who could carry the church forward. In practice, of course, human politics also played a role. Throughout history, conclaves have often involved intense debate, factional maneuvering, and even dramatic standoffs. In the medieval era, conclaves sometimes dragged on for weeks or months. In one case, in the 1200s, the process lasted nearly 3 years, and the cardinals had to be locked in and starved to force a decision. Today, the procedure is more streamlined. The cardinals cast secret ballots with 1 round of voting on the first day and 4 rounds each day thereafter. To be elected, a candidate must receive a 2/3 majority. After each round, the ballots are burned in a special stove inside the chapel, sending smoke up through a temporary chimney. Black smoke signals to the watching world that no decision has been reached. White smoke, accompanied by the ringing of church bells, announces that a new pope has been chosen. As the world watched for the telltale white smoke, many reflected on the long and often turbulent history of the papacy. According to Catholic tradition, the first pope was Saint Peter, one of Jesus Christ's original apostles. Over the centuries, the papacy has survived schisms, scandals, political intrigue, war, and reform. It is the second oldest surviving monarchy in the world after Japan's chrysanthemum throne. The role of Pope is unique. He is not just the head of the Catholic Church, but also the sovereign of the world's smallest independent nation, Vatican City. Yet unlike kings and emperors, popes are elected, not born into office. They hold moral and spiritual authority over more than 1 billion Catholics, and their influence often extends far beyond the walls of the Church. Throughout history, some popes have reigned for decades, shaping the world stage. Others have lasted mere days or weeks, leaving little mark at all. Some, like John Paul II, became global icons. Others, like Benedict XVI, shocked the world by resigning. Francis stood out as a figure of profound humility and moral clarity, a pope who reminded the world that leadership is not about power, but about service. As the cardinals prepared to elect Francis's successor, questions swirled. Would they choose another reformer, a traditionalist, a bridge builder? Between the two names circulated in the media, cardinals from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from Europe. But as always, the conclave remained unpredictable, sealed behind closed doors, waiting for the white smoke that would signal a decision. What is certain is that whoever takes up the mantle next will do so, standing on the shoulders of a giant. Pope Francis's legacy of humility, justice, compassion, and fearless reform will continue to echo through the Church for generations. His final chapter is written, but his impact lives on,